14-year-old boy walks past the newly opening Duck Donuts and sees a now hiring sign in the window. The school year would soon be over, and he decides this would be a great opportunity for a summer job. He runs back to his house, grabs his resume, and goes back to the store. He walks in the unfinished building and sees a man sitting behind the table. He hands him an application, tells him to fill him out, and that he'll be interviewed shortly. After a short time has passed, he's called back for the interview. He's asked a series of questions, each one being answered with confidence and poise. At the conclusion of the interview, the manager tells him that he would like to hire him. A few weeks go by, but the boy still hasn't received a call, so he decides to find out what has happened. Apparently, while it is legal to hire a 14-year-old, he did not get the job because of government regulations and insurance liabilities. The boy was outraged. He wanted to work, and the Duck Donuts wanted to hire him. Because of regulations, he did not get the job. That 14-year-old boy was me in the summer of 2015. Because of my parents' involvement in numerous political organizations, I'd always been exposed to politics, but I had never really been interested. But after this, I began to take an interest. I realized government policies would only start to have more and more of an impact on my everyday life. If you don't take an interest in government, the government will take an interest in you. By this time, I had formed many beliefs on what the government should not do, but I soon realized that I had ignored the important fact that they had a legitimate purpose. I didn't know what the proper role of government was. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and the conclusion I came to is something called Theocratic libertarianism. This is a political theology that embraces a libertarian government so that there is limited government and maximum individual liberty, while also promoting Christian principles and values. The issue of church and state relations has been an ongoing discussion for hundreds of years. There have been many different approaches on how it should work out. The first person to talk about this concept of spirit sovereignty was ironically a pagan, Plato. While there was not any church in Plato's time, he still had very important observations that would influence Christian thought. His most important observation was his definition of justice that was found in the Republic. According to Plato, quote, "To do one's own business and to not be a busybody is justice," end quote. This is very important in understanding political philosophy. The state should not interfere with the church or the individual. According to Plato, all parts of society, namely the church, the state, and family, should do their own jobs without overstepping their boundaries. Historically, there have been many instances where church and state relations have been put into practice. Traditionally, emperors would resolve disputes between different cults in the empire, so Constantine thought that it was part of his responsibilities as emperor to call the Council of Nicaea to settle the Arian controversy. This would imply a degree of state authority over the church. However, Bishop Ambrose of Milan excommunicated the Christian emperor Theodosius for initiating a massacre in retaliation for the murder of one of his officials in Thessalonica. This implied that the church could hold the emperor accountable for his actions that would have traditionally been political. Also, there have been many Christian theologians that have given their input on church and state relations. Augustine, the Cappadocians, Gelasius, and Luther, among others, have all developed important theories, which were all variations of the concept of spirit sovereignty that was first developed by Plato. It's in this discussion that we find theocratic libertarianism. It not only upholds Plato's definition of justice, but it also affirms that the church should inform the state. If you look at the history of Christian thought in the last 2,000 years, theocratic libertarianism is the only political theory that makes sense. Theocratic libertarianism is the most biblically and historically accurate political theology. Following this model will lead to a vibrant and flourishing society. I will argue this from 3 vantage points of freedom, justice, and economics. First, theocratic libertarianism represents the richest expression of Christian justice. Secondly, it provides the perfect balance between positive and negative freedom. And finally, it is the most economically stable form of government. First, it represents the richest expression of Christian justice. If you look at any good Christian society in the past 2 millennia, you will see certain principles that emerge. One of those principles is a Christian conception of justice. A Christian society must be just. In fact, justice is always the goal of any society, even those that aren't Christian. But while justice is always the goal, it is oftentimes very ambiguous what we mean by that. So what is justice? To answer that question, Christians have gone back to Plato. To do one's own business applies to both the individual and the larger society. Just as the soul needs to be balanced, so should society also be balanced. Each area of society must do its own job and not interfere with any other area of society. Augustine develops Plato's conception of eternal justice in terms of the Christian conception of love. He incorporated Christianity into his definition, which is something that Plato lacked. For Augustine, justice is directly linked to the love and adoration of God. Augustine said justice, quote, is love serving God only, and therefore ruling well all else, end quote. This definition of justice is what determines what makes a good political state. True justice can only be found in the city of God, and earthly cities must try to imitate the heavenly city. A just society must be based upon Christian love. We must have this Christian aspect to justice if we want to have a sustainable society. However, we must not forget about the concept of sphere sovereignty. While a society must have Christian love, that is not the role of the state to enforce. Individual citizens must choose for themselves that they will be just. Justice, by definition, cannot be coerced. For example, let's say a man decides to give to a poor. That is a just action. But when the state comes in and forces him to give, that is no longer justice, that is theft. These are two very different actions here. The end result is the same, but only one of those scenarios is just. Thomas Aquinas has helped to make a good distinction here. For Aquinas, there are two different types of justice, general and particular. General justice governs our actions that are according to the common good. We must do what is beneficial to the community rather than what is beneficial to an individual. The society should enact laws that benefit everyone. This general justice is a justice that the state has the authority to enforce. This means general laws like prohibiting murder and stealing. However, we cannot fulfill the true meaning of justice if we only focus on this aspect. We must also have particular justice, which is a justice that governs our interactions with individual people. With particular justice, we focus on the good of the individual rather than the good of society as a whole. This is where Christian love comes into play. There is not a state forcing you to follow the requirements of particular justice. The church encourages it, but ultimately the individual must choose for himself to have particular justice. Without this, a society will ultimately collapse. The problem with many forms of government is that they do not understand these two different types of justice. They place too much importance on one of these two forms. Both options will ultimately lead to an unstable society. Secular libertarianism places too much of a priority on general justice, while it completely ignores particular justice. This produces a society with great freedom but no moral standard. On the other hand, authoritarianism is only concerned about particular justice at the expense of freedom. The problem then becomes how to have a society that has freedom while still maintaining an absolute moral standard, or in other words, how to have a society with both general and particular justice. The solution to this problem is theocratic libertarianism. It first recognizes that justice it recognizes general justice with its principle of a limited state and individual liberty. The state has authority over legal matters and should provide general laws that allow for each sphere of society to do its own job. The state cannot regulate morality. That is where particular justice comes in. We must have Christian principles in our society. A society without individuals who have particular justice will ultimately collapse. Theocratic libertarianism allows for a society with freedom, but also an absolute moral standard. Secondly, theocratic libertarianism provides a perfect balance between positive and negative freedom. In the discussion of political theory, it is generally recognized that there are two types of freedom: positive freedom and negative freedom. This conception was developed by Isaiah Berlin, a Russian-British social and political theorist. For Berlin, positive and negative freedom were not only two different views of freedom, they were actually two distinctly different and incompatible political ideals. The way you interpret freedom has huge implications on your political system. Negative freedom is the absence of restraints or barriers. This allows for the individual to do whatever he wants. Positive freedom, on the other hand, is acting in a way where the individual controls his own actions and realizes his true potential. Negative freedom requires the absence of something, while positive freedom requires the presence of something. Applying these two conceptions of freedom will get two very different results. Negative freedom will ultimately lead to a secular libertarian society. The state is very small and the individual has the majority of the power. This society seems like it's extremely free, but the problem here is that virtue is completely ignored. On the other hand, when you apply positive freedom in this state, it leads to an authoritarian society. This is because positive freedom focuses solely on virtue, and if you try to apply that to the state, it is ultimately self-contradictory. Virtue cannot be coerced, and the state has no way to promote virtue other than coercion. You will run into problems when you apply both negative and positive freedom in the state. We must have a society that is in between these two extremes, that it has individual freedom and that virtue is also promoted. In order to discover this type of society, we can look at the golden triangle of freedom that was developed by Os Guinness. According to Guinness, the golden triangle of freedom is the idea that, quote, freedom requires virtue, which requires faith. which requires freedom, which in turn requires virtue, which requires faith, which requires freedom, and so on, like the recycling triangle ad infinitum, end quote. Let's look at the first leg of the triangle, that freedom requires virtue. The idea that virtue is necessary for a free society is an idea we keep returning to over and over again. As Benjamin Franklin said, quote, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom, end quote. John Adams also has pointed out that, quote, the only foundation of a free constitution is pure virtue, and if this cannot be inspired into our people in a greater measure than they have it now, they may exchange their rulers and the forms of government, but they will not obtain a lasting liberty, end quote. Secondly, virtue requires faith. You cannot have virtuous society if you don't have a faith upon which to base that virtue. Third, faith requires freedom. This goes back to the idea that virtue can't be coerced. You can force people to go to church, but you can't force them to have faith. Thus, true faith requires freedom, which of course cannot be sustained without virtue, which must be based upon faith. Following this roadmap will lead us to the society that is the solution to the dilemma we encountered earlier. Negative freedom focuses solely on freedom, but positive freedom focuses only on virtue. There is one element of the triangle that is missing, faith. In order to have a society that is balanced between positive and negative freedom, you must have faith, specifically the Christian faith. Even Benjamin Franklin, who had made it clear he would never become a Christian, stated, quote, as to Jesus of Nazareth, my opinion of whom you particularly desire, I think the system of morals and his religion, as he left them to us, is the best the world ever saw or is likely to see, end quote. The Christian faith is necessary for a free society. So what is a society that has all three elements of freedom, virtue, and faith? That society is a theocratic libertarianism. It has freedom, as is the nature of a libertarianism. It also recognizes that there must be virtue in its citizens in order for that freedom to be sustained. And finally, it has the Christian faith to provide a basis for that virtue. Freedom and virtue both flow from its Christian faith. Because of its faith, it is the perfect balance between positive and negative freedom. Third, theocratic libertarianism is the most economically stable form of government. For a libertarian, the best system of economics is capitalism. Theocratic libertarianism keeps this same ideal of the free market and capitalism, but it guides and directs it with Christian principles and values. Friedrich Hayek defined capitalism as, quote, the system of free markets and the private ownership as the means of production, end quote. This system will lead to an unprecedented product development and distribution, along with unparalleled economic prosperity. It also leads to individual wealth, because the individual knows the harder he works, the more money he'll make. If you look at countries throughout history that have had great economic success, they have all had some form of capitalism. A great example of this is comparing America to the Soviet Union. America had an abundance of food and goods, while people in the Soviet Union were starving. Capitalism leads to bread lined up on the shelves, while communism leads to bread lines. If capitalism is this great libertarian ideal, how does Christianity line up with that? According to Max Weber in his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, the Protestant work ethic was an important factor in the economic success of Protestant groups in the early stages of European capitalism. This stems from Calvin's theory of predestination. All men are predestined to either salvation and eternal life or are condemned to hell. Naturally, Calvinists wanted to figure out who the elect were. If you became successful in business, this could be a sign you were among the elect. Weber argued that it was this that motivated capitalism. There was also a sense that your worldly job was not only a job, but a God-given calling. Because Protestants saw the worldly profession as both their calling and a way to prove that they were among the elect, they worked extremely hard. This worked great in a capitalistic society, where hard work is vital to a flourishing economy. In this sense, Christianity is necessary to have a stable capitalism. Steve Bannon, chief strategist to President Trump, has recently made the argument that Christianity is a necessary corrective that keeps capitalism from degenerating into self-centered narcissistic consumerism. According to Bannon, quote, one thing I want to make sure of, if you look at the leaders of capitalism at that time, when capitalism was at, I believe, its highest flower and spreading its benefits to most of mankind, almost all of those capitalists were strong believers in the Judeo-Christian West. They were either active participants in the Jewish faith, or they were active participants in the Christian faith, and they took their beliefs, and the underpinnings of their belief was manifested in the work that they did, end quote. In addition, George Gilder has argued that capitalism always begins with servitude and gift-giving. To generate money, one must first give of oneself for the service of others. Gilder argues that, quote, entrepreneurs, by the very nature of what they do, must shun greed, end quote. In creating a product, entrepreneurs must be focused on how that product can help others. Profit is actually the measure of how well a company has served others. He also states that, quote, capitalism is at its essence a competition of giving, end quote. Of course, there is some amount of self-interest that is involved, but you can only help yourself by first helping others. In order to have vibrant capitalism, not only do you need the Protestant work ethic, but you also need virtue. Those that will oppose capitalism often point out how it can lead to individuals just focusing on money and not worrying about morality. However, in a Christian society, that is not a problem. Christianity has the ideal of focusing on the needs of others as more important than your own. If society is focused on that, capitalism will not fall into greed or self-centered consumerism. Thus far, I have shown that theocratic libertarianism is the most biblically and historically accurate political theology. It is not only the only system that is both truly just and truly free, but is also the most economically flourishing form of government. However, there are those who would oppose theocratic libertarianism on the grounds that I'm ignoring the separation of church and state. They would say that the church would be far too involved in the political sphere. According to them, religion is a private affair that has no, or at most radically minimal, involvement in the state. Theocratic libertarianism would be far too close to a theocracy. It would either lead to a state run by the church or a church run by the state. However, in saying this, they would be ignoring an important fact. There is no such thing as a separation of church and state. If you examine any of the founding documents of America, you will not find the phrase separation of church and state mentioned once. The only place you find that is in a letter written by Thomas Jefferson. That letter had no actual authority. It was the opinion of one man and was never implemented in our government before 1940. A number of scholars reject the idea that the separation between church and state is even a constitutional principle. The church does have a legitimate place to be involved in the state. It shouldn't run the state, but it can and should inform the state on moral issues. That is exactly what I'm arguing for. The church would be in the position of informing the state. It would not lead it to a theocracy because one of the main principles is that virtue cannot be coerced. In a theocracy, the state tries to coerce virtue. It would also not lead to a state-run church because another one of its main principles is limited government. The state should be as small as possible, and that certainly means not having a state-run church. Others would object by arguing that Christianity and libertarianism are incompatible. They would say Christianity is far too morally demanding to work with a libertarianism. Libertarian allows you to do whatever you want, while Christianity requires you to follow certain moral guidelines. The individualistic nature of libertarianism cannot be compatible with the ideals of loving your neighbor that is found in Christianity. However, I would argue that Christianity and libertarianism are very compatible. I would argue that they even follow from one another. As Galatians 5:13 says, quote, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love." Individuals should be using their freedom to serve one another, but that does not mean that they are required to. Freedom is the ability to make your own choices. But if you make the wrong choice, you must accept the consequences of that choice. Everyone has the free gift of salvation, but if they choose not to accept it, they must suffer the consequences. Those who would make this argument that Christianity and libertarianism are incompatible are ignoring this concept, the concept of sphere sovereignty. You must have a libertarian state so that you can have a flourishing Christianity. And you must have Christianity so that you can have a libertarian state. If you look at libertarianism and Christianity through the lenses of their respective spheres, it is clear that they are completely compatible. In conclusion, I would like to take us back to the city of Philadelphia in the year 1787. The deliberations of the Constitutional Convention were held in strict secrecy at the Independence Hall. As a result, many citizens had gathered outside the doors to find out what had happened in those sessions. They knew that whatever happened in that room would have a direct impact on their lives. The founders could establish whatever form of government they wanted. Many people supported a new monarchy, with George Washington as the king. Others supported a republic. They were anxious to find out what their new form of government would be. The session went on and on as the men inside debated. Finally, the debating stopped, and the session ended. The men came out to find a group of people waiting outside the doors. The first man outside was Ben Franklin. Immediately after he stepped through the door, an anxious woman asked him, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" With absolutely no hesitation at all, Franklin responded, "A republic, if you can keep it." Franklin knew that the self-governed representative republic that he had just helped to create was only sustainable with a moral and virtuous people. Now, nearly 250 years later, our society has strayed far from the moral standard necessary for a republic. Our nation cannot function for much longer as it is now. As a society, we have a choice to make. Will we return to Christian principles and values, or will we continue to turn towards secularism and lose any trace of freedom that we once had in this nation? The good news is there are several indicators that suggests a new conservative Christian age is on the horizon. And so the best days for theocratic libertarianism may be yet to come.
Well, nice job, Luke. Very, very, very clear. My questions mainly just have to do with defining a few terms. So when Plato says that to do one's own business, that is the definition of justice, and not be a busybody. Could that also be a definition of freedom, however? Well, what does he mean to do one's business?
Basically, yeah. What Plato means by his definition is that he applies justice to both the individual person and society on a larger level. So the soul needs to be balanced. He has 4 parts to the soul. I forget exactly what. I think it's justice, wisdom, courage, and temperance are the 4 parts, I believe. And justice is when all these parts are balanced, and then once they're balanced, then virtue is produced. So that's his model for the soul, and he argues that society as a whole should reflect the individual soul. So just as the soul needs to be balanced, the society has these same parts and need to be balanced as well. And he would also apply this to the different spheres of society, the 3 main ones being the church, the state, and the family. So they all need to do their jobs that they have in place. They need to stay inside their boundaries and not overstep their boundaries and do what they're supposed to do. And if they do that, then that would be a just society.
Okay. So sort of running with this definition, then there's it seems to me there's some overlap between justice and freedom.
Oh yeah, certainly there is some overlap. I mean, if you examine my arguments, it's the same basic principle that if you go to there's general justice and particular justice, and the positive and negative freedom. Those are very closely related. Like if you follow general justice, if you follow that to an extreme, you'll lead to a secular libertarian society. Justice, if you follow negative freedom, will also lead to that. And if you follow particular justice, that will lead to an authoritarian society, just as positive freedom will also lead to that. So my argument is that we need to find a good point in the middle between these 2 extremes. And the solution I came up with is theocratic libertarianism.
Okay. Real quick, when you said that justice cannot be coerced,
yeah.
Is having laws, is that a coercion of justice?
To an extent, but that's why I argue that there's only certain laws that the government has the authority to put in place, following general justice. So general laws like don't murder, don't steal, things like that. But when you try to enforce laws that would fall under the particular justice category, that's not their role to enforce. To answer your question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
My question, I really appreciate this thesis. You covered a lot of ground in a short time, and it was very, very stimulating. And you began with an example of how the state regulating things, overreaching perhaps in regulating a work age. And I'm interested in how the theocratic libertarianism might apply in other practical situations that you might face. Like, should the government regulate a driving age?
I don't believe the government should regulate driving age.
Should the government regulate the marijuana smoking?
I don't believe they should.
Should the government regulate prostitution?
Just get cut off after.
This is an issue that has come, we've had some debates in debate class about this. How about prostitution? Should the government legalize prostitution?
Yes.
Careful, Luke.
I believe, well, when I say these things, I don't agree that these things are moral, that we should be participating in them.
Right.
I think that the role of that is not the state to enforce. The church should then say that these things are immoral and that we should not be doing them.
Okay, so do you have an overall criteria? How would you distinguish what the government should be involved in regulating and what they should stay out of?
Basically, I generally like to say that you should be able to basically have as much freedom as possible as long as your freedom doesn't impede on other individuals' freedom. That's what I generally do. So things like legalizing marijuana or prostitution don't necessarily impede on other individuals' freedom. So that's why I would be okay with legalizing those. But things like murder and theft, that's impeding on somebody else's right to life and property. So that's why I would say that the state has the right to prohibit those.
So thank you for your presentation. I especially appreciate the multiple angles that you use to support theocratic libertarianism. I may have just missed it. What is the definition of theocratic libertarianism?
Yeah, theocratic libertarianism is a political theology that embraces a libertarian government so that there is limited government and maximum individual liberty while also promoting Christian principles and values.
I guess what I mean is, more specifically, what does that look like? I think that is, maybe it's just thinking something like a description of what it hopes to achieve. What would it look like more concretely in terms of governmental structures? I guess I kind of got the answer to Sir Pon's question. So it's, do correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like it's going to be basically libertarian form of government with the church playing some kind of positive role.
Yes, essentially, it's a libertarian government, but I argue that that can't be sustained if you don't have a moral society. So that's where the church comes into play, and the church is governing over the moral aspects of society. And if you don't have that, then the society will collapse.
And I guess the question is, so how does that, so this is a kind of government, so how does the church like to government? I think you use the word inform, maybe that'd be a better way to ask it. So what does it mean by the church informed to say that as part of a legal structure? Is the church like a Supreme Court kind of entity? So what really is the relationship, that's what we're asking, between the church and state here?
Well, I get a little nervous by having the church to have a legal structure, because if the church is involved too much in the state, that would lead to more of a theocracy, which is not good. But I would say that there should be possibly maybe like church officials informing members of the government. The church doesn't have any actual legal power, but they should have a sway on the government from a moral standpoint.
Okay, so there's no legal tie between the church and the state, but the church has a moral sway.
Yes.
I think the irony to all this is if this ever comes to pass, the one regulation that the government will be passing is on donuts. That would be wonderful.
That's the one very good.
I could still see the bitterness in your eyes. This was excellent, Luke. This is obviously a very complicated issue.
Yes.
You had to deal with a lot, and those of you who don't know, he left out a lot in his narratio. He covered all the different church-state relationships, from Symphonia and Two Swords theory and the Two Kingdoms theory of Luther, and on and on and on. It was like drinking from a fire hydrant, I think, the first time we heard it. Mm-hmm. So I love how you were able to edit well, bring it down to the basic points, and then present it in a very clear and cogent manner. Well done. Thank you.